I've got some good news. Apparently Canon didn't stop all third-party lens makers from making RF glass. I've got this new Pergear 35mm f1.4, and they told me what Canon's really up to. Details coming up, but first I encourage you to subscribe and choose all notifications so that way you can stay up to date on the latest camera gear, news, and rumors. Earlier this year, I broke the story that Canon had come down like a bag of wet hammers on third-party manufacturers of RF glass and accessories that required them to receive Canon's permission in order to make RF lenses and adapters. And while it's true that Canon is seeking permission from third-party lens makers to make RF glass, Pergear told me that there isn't any problem with manual focus, that Canon's only coming down on third-party lens makers producing lenses with autofocus. So the skies aren't nearly as dark and as foreboding as we once thought. We thought that basically Canon had come down like a bag of wet hammers on all third-party lens makers producing any sort of lenses, and based on how we saw these companies exiting from the market, it certainly looked like it affected all of them. But today, now we know that if you're making third-party lenses and it doesn't have autofocus, well, then you don't have any issues whatsoever. Canon's not coming down on you like a bag of wet hammers saying that you can't make lenses. And if you want to find out about this new Pergear 35mm f1.4 lens, are you ready for the price of this thing? It's only $129, and it's really, really tiny. If I take off this lens cap here, well, it's even smaller. I mean, look at the size of this thing. It's just really tiny. But let's get to some tests and find out how good it is, what sort of aberration it has, what sort of sharpness it has from the center to the edges throughout the focal ratio range. Before we get to the first set of images shot at f1.4, just to let you know, it's December here. It gets dark early. Everything outside is brown. There's absolutely no color, and there's really very little wildlife around. So I went to my closest department store as it's a low light paradise with lots of color. For these shots, I'm shooting at 1/60th of a second. Again, it's f1.4. And with the camera having 5 stops of IBIS, it means that I really shouldn't get any motion blur with 1/60th of a second. Most of the time, chromatic aberration isn't that bad with a Pergear 35mm f1.4. But sometimes it's so strong that it further degrades the sharpness, as you can see here zoomed in. However, the reindeer gives us a chance to see the extent of the sharpness produced at f1.4. Using the Canon RF 50mm f1.2 as a baseline, we can see that the results are very sharp when zoomed in. In several shots, the chromatic aberration wasn't worse, but when it was there, when it was present, along with a lack of sharpness, I was pretty dejected. I thought, like, I don't want to do this review anymore. I'm not happy with the results. Then I remembered, as I pondered this a little bit, because this isn't the first, well, third-party lens that I've reviewed for this channel, and not the last one that certainly not the first one I've done for Pergear. And one thing I realized is whenever you're shooting wide open at that widest aperture, and in this case f1.4, I noticed that the sharpness was definitely not the best. And in terms of chromatic aberration or any sort of aberration, it was always worst at that wide open aperture. So I thought, well, okay, well, what if I stop it down a stop or two, such as f2.8, f4, or even f5.6? So for the next test, I shot at f2.8, and the aberration is noticeably improved, also giving better sharpness, but still not as sharp as the $2,300 Canon RF 50mm f1.2, but then again, it's an extra $2,200 more. But I'd say the results are definitely acceptable, especially for those starting out, those on a tight budget looking for something affordable, or somebody looking at gifting that someone special in their family an affordable lens where $129 is within reach. Shooting at f4 delivered a slightly better image, as did f5.6. I had a lot of fun shooting with this 35mm f1.4. I love autofocus. It's a big selling point for Canon, but there's nothing like shooting manual focus with a prime regardless of the price. It takes me back to the 70s and early 80s when shooting manual was common. There are plenty of renowned photographers that didn't always nail focus, from the 50s, 60s, and even up until the 80s. Pictures don't always have to be in focus. They don't always have to be super sharp. In fact, shooting out of focus is a style still practiced today, like this photo by Maria Tudela Bermudez, or this one by Henke Lee. When shooting with Canon glass such as the 100mm f2.8 or the 50mm f1.2 that I've got on right now, or even this incredible masterpiece here, the 100 to 500mm, that has such incredible image stabilization that you can shoot video handheld and you get spectacular results. Well, you expect that. The prices of these lenses, $1,000 to $1,400 for the 100mm, what, $2,800 or so, $2,300 for the 50mm f1.2. and the 100 to 500 millimeter, some $2,800, $2,900. What you expect when you pay that much is you expect perfection. Sharpness from the center to the edges, regardless of what focal distance or what aperture you're shooting at, you want perfection. You expect it, whether it's the 100 to 500 millimeter, the 100 millimeter, or the 50 millimeter f1.2. However, when you see a lens that's $129, if you haven't already dismissed the lens, well, something magical happens, because once you put this on the camera, you're now putting in the shutter separately. You're putting in the f-stop separately. You're putting in the ISO separately. You're focusing manually. You find that you're doing everything manually. And while yes, on the Canon R5 I can shoot in FV mode, and yes, I can adjust the ISO or automatically, or even the shutter automatically, what you find out doing is you're going back in time. This lens, this Pergear 35mm f1.4, is a time machine. It takes you back to a simpler time when taking photos definitely wasn't simpler, where pulling focus and nailing focus, well, if you didn't quite get it, people weren't going to point at your photos and say you got it wrong. It was an exciting time, and whenever I play with these third-party lenses with manual focus where they don't have the best sharpness, I always take it on me as a bit of a challenge. What's the best that I can get? What's the best aperture that I can shoot at? And if you're interested in the Pergear 35mm f1.2 at $129, my advice is don't shoot at f1.4. While yes, you can shoot wide open at f1.4, you're going to find that the amount of successful photos you're going to get without any aberration or where the sharpness is going to be acceptable, well, I didn't want to take that chance. But if you go to f2.8 or even f2, you definitely get much better results. Oh, and one other thing I want to show you too. This is when I was shooting in the store at f1.8, and you can see there's definitely a curvature towards the corners, so you definitely see a loss of sharpness and some distortion in the corners as well. But again, I found that I was quite happy with the photos, and I'm not the world's best photographer. I can shoot video no problem. I can get the lighting set up. So please forgive my sample images of stills here, because yeah, it certainly wasn't the best. And in the department store in Canadian Tire, I was definitely playing with some really low light situations, and even shooting at f1.4, I think my ISO ranged between 250 and I think 800, although most of them are around 250 to 400. It was certainly a lot of fun. And I'm going to keep this lens. I'm not going to sell it because there's just something magical, that's a good word. There's something magical about taking the R5 out, one of the masterpieces of modern cameras out there, and then strapping on a lens that takes you back to the 70s and 80s. And what I think is really magical about a lens like this is it teaches you to be a better photographer. You have to understand why you're using the shutter speed you're using. You have to understand why and when to use auto ISO, what ISO you want. But of course, you also have to learn how focus works, how to pull focus manually, because even if you have a camera, like most people do today with a really good autofocus system, there are times when you need to park that, you need to switch it over to manual focus, especially if you're shooting product shots. But the good news in this video is that Canon isn't coming down like a bag of wet hammers on all third-party lens makers, only those that are employing its autofocus system. And if that's the case, well, then they do need to seek permission from Canon. But like Pergear, if you're producing lenses that have manual focus without any autofocus, well, there's still plenty of lenses out there. And I believe TT Arson is also coming out with a lens, and it's got an aperture of 0.95. I can't remember the focal length. I think it might be 35 or 50 millimeters. It's definitely a prime. I just don't recall. They sent me something not too long ago too, asking if I do a review. So as far as third-party lenses, well, there's plenty of them out there, and we're going to see more shortly. And if you want to stay up to date on the latest news and rumors or reviews of third-party lenses, or even news about third-party lens manufacturers and what's going on, well, then go ahead and hit that subscribe button, but make sure you also choose all notifications. By choosing all notifications, as soon as I publish a new video like this one here, you'll get notified by YouTube, so that way you can stay up to date on all the latest camera news and rumors. I cover all the major camera brands, all the major camera models, news and rumors, and I also do reviews. So instead of scrubbing all the latest Twitter feeds, RSS feeds, websites, YouTube channels, books, magazines, and well, etc., go ahead and subscribe and choose all notifications, because I'm your one-stop and I produce content all the time. I think I do about an average of 1.5 videos a day. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you again soon.